everyone, and welcome to the Boston Symposium on Economics. For this year's symposium, we have selected a theme of political economics and election evaluation, a selection which felt especially relevant given the nature of 2024 as a global election year, where voters in over 60 countries went to the polls. In the early weeks of the new year, as the outcomes of these elections continue to take effect, we wish to unpack some of their wider implications and develop a better understanding of their societal effects. Political economics, in studying the bilateral relationship that exists between politics and economics, provides insight into election mechanisms and governmental actions, such as policy formation and international exchange. We hope that you leave the symposium equipped with a strong knowledge of the modern applications of this field of study. Additionally, we believe that the content of our discussion will provide a highly nuanced perspective, which will allow you to better understand the international political and economic events in the coming months and years. Today, you will hear from 3 speakers, each with unique expertise in the world of political economics. Their presentations will use specific political philosophies to unpack recent elections, globalization, social policy, and much more. We are so excited to host such accomplished, knowledgeable academics and professionals, and can't wait to hear what they have to say. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And without further ado, let me introduce our first keynote speaker. Rita Kiki Edozie is a professor of international relations and global governance at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Kiki has served as the university's inaugural Deval Patrick Endowed Chair for Political, Economic, and Social Innovation, and was the interim dean and associate dean of the John W. McCormack School of Policy and Global Studies until the school was merged with the College of Liberal Arts in 2023. Receiving her PhD in politics from New York City's New School for Social Research in 1999, Kiki has been a teacher scholar and an academic administrator of graduate education and undergraduate studies for over 20 years. Prior to UMass Boston, Kiki was a professor of international relations at Michigan State University's James Madison College of Public and International Affairs, and the director of African American and African Studies at the university's College of Arts and Letters. She was also the deputy director of the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Kiki is an accomplished scholar and author of several academic books and scholarly articles on global development, comparative democratization, African affairs, and race and identity. Some of Kiki's books include The African Union's Africa, New Pan-African Initiatives in Global Governance, and Pan-Africa Rising, The Cultural Political Economy of Nigeria's Afro-Capitalism and South Africa's Ubuntu Business. Her most recent book, Africa's New Global Politics, Regionalism in International Relations, received Choice Magazine's 2022 rating as highly recommended reading. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kiki Edozie.
Thank you, Izzy, and thank you to the Women's Club and the Northeastern Boston Economics Club for the invitation. Really, such a pleasure to be here. Thank you. So I've titled my talk today as the International Political Economy of Democracy, seen through the 2024 US presidential elections. But I did retitle it a little bit after writing it, and as I'm talking, just think about the title, the globalization democracy paradox. Again, the U.S. presidential elections as and the world economy as a case study. So I've got a lot of slides. So let me rush through them because I know I only have about 40 minutes. On January 2025, Canada's longtime Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, announced his resignation effective March of this year, when his Liberal Party would have selected his replacement, he said. While Trudeau had been sort of unpopular in his party for a while now, in the US, the new president-elect at the time, of when I was writing this, but now he is President Donald Trump, took credit for his northern neighbor's demise. just a few weeks earlier, President Trump had announced that upon resuming office, he would slap 25% tariffs on Canadian products as punishment for the US's trade deficit with its northern neighbor. In January 2025, Canada reported really an 8.2 billion surplus, trade surplus, with the US. Trump also joked that Canada would do well as the 51st US state. So Canada's next elections for prime minister won't occur until October later this year, and yet there is no doubt that the tariff question and US-Canada relations will inform the run-up to the prime minister's elections. As it happened around the world in 2024, in Canada too, global trade and other issues related to economic globalization will influence yet another liberal democracy electoral outcome. So global trade, inflation, loss of manufacturing jobs, and other economic issues have been identified as the reason for a worldwide wave for ousting incumbent politicians in 2024. Incumbent upsets have happened last year alone in the UK, in France, in India, in Japan, in Senegal, in Bangladesh, and in even South Africa, to name a few. The US presidential election was perhaps the most famous incumbent loss of 2024 during his short 3-month presidential campaign. And we say it's short, presidential campaign because former Vice President Kamala Harris only had about 3 months, as a candidate. But the Democratic nominee for the 2024 elections, President Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, enacting tariffs against Canada. This is President Trump doing this. Canada, China, and a host of other countries was President Trump's main economic message to the American electorate that prioritized economic issues as the top motivation for their selection of him as president over Harris. Out of as many as 13 issues identified by US presidential voters in 2024, economic issues were identified by the highest share of 52% of the voters. The 2024 American presidential election illustrates a growing trend in national elections around the world, especially in Western liberal democracies, that economic issues, including concerns about post-global pandemic inflation, global trade agreements, and unfair economic globalization that induced inequality are top issues of concern. So what is the reason behind this trend? In a 2018 book, economist Danny Roderick describes how forces of economic globalization have blunted the instruments of national economic policy and weakened liberal democracies' capacity to provide economic welfare, redistribution, and even affordable consumption for their citizens. In an earlier book, Roderick refers to this phenomenon as the globalization paradox. He describes the paradox as the tension between globalization and self-determination. The globalization paradox is also a democracy paradox, occurring when social arrangements of democracies clash with the international demands of globalization. This happens because globalization transfers control from democratically accountable governments to multinational corporations, international banks, and to international organizations. This creates a gap between national and international governance that is also sometimes called the democratic deficit. Roderick was one of the first scholars to introduce this tension that we see manifest in the US 2024 elections. He argues that the problem for democracies in a global era is the challenge to simultaneously pursue democracy, national self-determination, and economic globalization. So the globalization democracy paradox is both a crisis of globalization as well as of liberal democracy. And it is increasingly characterized negatively around the world. Writing about globalization in his 2003 book, and this was called Globalization and Its Discontents, economist Joseph Stiglitz identified a cohort of anti-globalization critics that he called globalization's discontents. But in the early millennium, at the end of the Cold War, when globalization, we call it 3.0, was ushered into the world stage, globalization's discontents used to be developing world countries who received the negative effects of globalization because of Thatcher, Reagan, and IMF neoliberal project policies. Then developing countries were forced to implement aggressive structural adjustments, economic policies such as laissez-faire trade, zero tariffs, privatization of state enterprises, forced devaluation of their economies, an end to state planning and social welfare provision. And ironically, the only good thing about this was the establishment of liberal democratic governments through regular elections. However, almost 20 years later, in 2018, Stiglitz wrote an updated version of that book, which became a classic text called Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited. In this book, Stiglitz writes about globalization's new discontents, where? In the advanced industrial world. They are your middle class and working classes of the advanced industrial nations of the global north. Although to Stiglitz, the United States and other advanced industrial countries wrote the rules of globalization and run the global institutions that govern it, yet in 2016, taking advantage of globalization's grievances, especially critics of America's trade agreements, a new activist Republican Party led by President Donald Trump blamed the plight of America on the worst trade agreements ever. After the 2008 financial crisis, which has been attributed to failures in globalization, criticism of globalization in the West has reached an all-time high. Because of the huge losses after the crisis in the West, especially in the US, globalization began to be associated with the evisceration of the middle classes, increasing income inequality, and the growth of an oligarchic power of multinational corporations. Says Stiglitz, by 2016, with the first presidential electoral success of Donald Trump, the new discontents took over the United States in the form of American populism. In the 2016 election, populists gave voice to voters' discontent with globalization. So generally, populism is defined by its emphasis on an ideology that pits a vague representation of people, the people, against a perceived corrupt elite. I use it today to describe politicians who present overly simplistic answers to complex questions in a highly emotional manner for political opportunism. On November 14th, just a week after the 2024 election, there is no surprise to learn that the European Centre for Populist Studies convened a panel to provide an in-depth exploration of how the 2024 US presidential election reflects and impacts global populism. Experts analyzed key dynamics, including economic grievances, cultural traits and shifts, and political polarization. It is commonplace these days to describe Western democracies' discontent with globalization and link it to working class populism. In a November 2023 survey of American working class communities, the authors write about a populist revolt rooted in working class discontent with sweeping economic and cultural changes that have bred a profound sense of social dislocation and insecurity. In a survey preface, the author, Will Marshall, notes that the new populists offer working class voters a refuge, and listen to this, in old ideas, ethnic nationalism, nativism, and protectionism. Conservative parties, Marshall continued, have tried to compete by co-opting these themes, while liberal and progressive parties have deployed the populists' illiberal and anti-democratic tendencies while failing to grasp their valid concerns and fears of not being heard. Marshall's thesis brings us ahead and center to an assessment of the 2024 US presidential election last November, and to my talk's thesis today, understanding the international drivers of domestic issues that informed the election. These days, populism is a global problem and has been attributed to a phenomenon called democratic backsliding, occurring in Hungary, Poland, India, all over the world, and now in the US. What these countries have in common is that populist forces who win the elections often cite the need for policies that buffer the people from the negative consequences of the neoliberal policies that underpin our era of globalization. And these are the surveys. I'm just going to leave them there for you to look at. But these are the benefits of globalization, clearly. But what is key is the problems of globalization and how they continue to affect our society. But the globalization democracy paradox provokes important questions for this election. The questions we want to ask ourselves are, why did Donald Trump win after losing in 2020? Who are the American working class, and what influence did this class have on the election outcome? What roles did race, ethnicity, and gender play, if at all? And is the American liberal democracy really becoming increasingly liberal and authoritarian? And so a Brookings Institute commentary by William Galston, and it was titled "Why Donald Trump Won and Kamala Harris Lost: An Early Analysis of the Results." I thought this was really interesting. It had this to say: Donald Trump's theory of the case was broadly correct. He and his campaign managers believed that it was possible to build on Republicans' growing strength among white working class voters to create a multi-ethnic working class coalition. He was right, Galston noted. If the polls turn out to be accurate, he made strides among Latinos, African Americans, and especially men. He increased his share of the black male vote from 12% to 20%, and he carried Hispanic men by 9 points. So post-election conventional wisdom argues that Donald Trump won the 2024 election because he was the change candidate who championed working class discontent. Nonetheless, Harris and Biden did speak to working class discontent as well, and that put them in the lead at some point in the national polls. For example, Harris committed to help with the cost of living. She blamed monopolies for inflation, and she vowed to shift power from the billionaires to the middle class. Yet, throughout the campaign, Trump, on the other hand, consistently and successfully branded Kamala Harris as a coastal elite liberal who had difficulty connecting with working class voters who were worried about the kind of structural changes that she could bring. And so where working class is categorized as people earning less than $50,000, Trump had a 15% swing among this voting bloc. When working class is categorized as Americans without a college degree, Trump also earned a majority of votes among this class as well. With 57% of the electorate understanding working class issues are pertinent in American election. And so Will Marshall's survey of non-college degree voters concluded that working class Americans believe that the last 40 years have not been kind to people like them. I just want to quickly just breeze through this. However, Marshall's survey on working class attitudes towards global trade reveals more mixed results among this class. When asked about the effect of trade on their everyday lives, 29% of them viewed trade agreements as positive, 35% as negative, 36% as not of great importance either way. When asked about the effects of past trade agreements on the US as a whole and their impact, 28% viewed trade agreements positively, 44% viewed them negatively, and 28% viewed no significant effects either way. But it should be noted that both Trump and Biden-Harris rejected free trade and acknowledged the corrosive effects of neoliberalism and trade agreements on the American economy. However, Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, offered a more empathetic response to working classes. So be that as it is, the working class coalition thesis as the reason why Trump and the Republicans won the 2024 elections is a complex one that is not straightforward, and it has not been fully fleshed out by its proponents. In the latest edition of Foreign Policy, Adam Tooze shows that rather than two classes in America, working class versus elite class, there are actually three. And Tooze argues that to understand the politics of the United States in the 21st century, you have to acknowledge this third class that he calls the professional managerial class, or the PMC. And he says members of this class are credentialed by education systems to occupy positions of authority within the economy and society at large. And they exercise control directly, often over working class Americans. They tend to average salaries about $100K a year. And according to Tooze, the stereotypical working class Trump voter admires Trump as the bullying, freewheeling, rich dude that he is, in part because he clearly scorns the professional class. The working class admires the billionaire's ability to flaunt and show disrespect and scorn for the values of the professional middle class, which the working class people claim to suffer from. This is what Who says, Trump and co. say out loud what many ordinary Americans think. They aren't afraid to say they don't share the values of the PMC, starting with the school teacher and the librarian, all the way up to the Ivy League professor and the folks on television who want to talk about transgender rights or structural racism or climate change. What Tools exposes here is that the working class populist vote for Trump and the Republicans has little to do with economic or materialist issues, but has more to do with cultural, social, and identity factors. That is why, even though Harris and the Democrats did reach out to working class and rural voters, they were unsuccessful. They were branded by the Republicans and Trump as being coastal elites and yuppies who lectured working classes, looked down on them, and were trying to impose their views on working classes. So consider this, for example. This is an important observation made by Bernie Sanders, the former foreign policy advisor of Bernie Sanders, and he's now the director of the Center for International Policy, and his name is Matt Duss. He made this in The Guardian just about a week ago. Duss referred to a key speech in the 2024 election cycle by J.D. Vance at the Republican National Convention, which laid out the party's roadmap for capturing durable working class majorities. Duss characterizes the speech as a foreign policy address, a major foreign policy address about how the Republican Party was going to capture the working class. He revealed how Vance used the battleground states like his hometown in Ohio as a place that had been cast aside and forgotten by America's ruling class in Washington. Duss says Democrats have become the party of war, said J.D. Vance. Americans are tired of it. Duss revealed how Vance attacked Biden for his past support of the North American Free Trade Agreement, for China's entry into the World Trade Organization, and for the disastrous invasion of Iraq. This is exactly what Vance said, and each step of the way, in small towns like mine in Ohio, or next door in Pennsylvania or Michigan, in other states across the country, jobs were sent overseas and our children were sent to war. This year's Democratic ticket has failed to provide a sufficient response. Instead of responding to the right's tech oligarchic-funded faux populism by offering a genuine alternative and attacking the real sources of our country's insecurity, they leaned instead into a defense of a militarist status quo, and most Americans rightly recognize as broken. They must not make this mistake again. Okay, so this brings me back to the main thesis about the IPE of democracy and the globalization democracy paradox. The political economy of democracy refers to democracy as a political system that interacts with and is influenced by economic factors, including how government policies are shaped by economic interests and how economic conditions can impact political outcomes. The globalization democracy paradox adds an international variable to the political economy of democracy, This framework helps us to understand the 2024 presidential election through the prism of these paradoxical dimensions: liberal democracy versus illiberal democracy, populism of the working class versus diversity, multiculturalism and inclusion, and globalization versus nationalism and isolationism. There are several contradictions, two key ones stemming from the above tensions for the US presidential elections last year. First is that while inflation and economic issues topped the list of most important issues that needed to be addressed by the candidates, and foreign policy issues tended to fall to the bottom. This is what Pew told us. But in reality, inflation and economic issues are indeed international issues. They're foreign policy issues. They should be posed as foreign policy issues. While Trump couched a solution to economic insecurity as the imposition of tariffs, he did not present American working classes with a realistic understanding of globalization and America's transformative role in the world economy. Populist leaders who exploit problems and seek to please voters without rational consideration as to the best course of action tend to govern badly. A second contradictory point is the racial and social identity factor vis-a-vis its expression of populism in America and in the last election. It was repeatedly noted that the Republican candidate successfully wooed the working class across ethnicity, race, and gender, while the Democratic candidate, Kamala Harris, and the party at large lost that important voter base to its peril. However, the Democrats may not have lost the US presidential election because of the working class factor. This is simplistic and it ignores the complex political economic interplay of liberal democracies, which are especially shaped by both national socio-cultural issues as well as international economic factors. What I mean is that targeting mostly the professional managerial classes, Harris and the Democrats, made saving democracy as the key theme of their campaign, subsuming, unfortunately, the economic security message under that issue so that it became sort of confounded by the saving democracy issue. The Democrats tried unsuccessfully to merge the saving democracy issue with the economic factor. However, despite offering economic security to all Americans and touting the successes of Bidenomics in a post-pandemic American economy, their message of saving democracy drowned out this economic security message. And the saving democracy message was also communicated in mostly social, cultural ways, and sometimes overtly personal ways in terms of articulating the attributes of Trump rather than the broader aspects of the global economy. So instead of focusing on the real problems of the world economy, Trump and the Republicans were also too easily willing to promote anti-pluralist populist policies, anti-civil rights, attacks on DEI, attacks on abortion rights, attacks on LGBTQ, xenophobia, and other sort of institutional, reversals, attacks on the press, attacks on the American presidency, things like that. So let me close. As to the question, what is needed for the future of democracy and our inherently globalized national economy in the US? So I'm tentative and can only raise more questions for you rather than providing absolute answers However, watch out for the cohort of leaders that have already identified interest in throwing their hats in the ring to contest the 2028 presidential election. I'm one American who feels, let's stop with the negativism. 4 years, it's a long time for us to regroup and, to do what we do in a democracy, which is to, propose an alternative. These are the cohorts. Barnes himself, Don Jr. has been identified, and Santos on the Republican side, and on the Democratic side, Newsom, Whitmer, and Shapiro, and I'm sure there are others. However, I don't feel that the answer to our future is isolationism, or even what some have referred to as a new kind of American transactionalism. It's not nationalism either, nor anti-globalism or oligarchism. And it's certainly not a turn, hopefully, to a liberal democracy or democratic backsliding. Alternatively, nations around the world, including ours, and political leaders and electorates in the US have to consider how to construct a fair democracy and a fair economy through democracy. We should consider how to bring together the welfare state and the innovation state. Our democratic civil liberties and societies will need to figure out how to protect our economic security without resorting to illiberal means, and nations around the world deserve fair trade over absolute free trade, and managed globalization rather than hyper-globalization. In a country as diverse as we are, candidates for the 2028 election will need to begin engaging the inclusivity of the electorate in truthful conversations about nexuses between globalization and domestic politics and economics. They've got to provide realistic and fair solutions to the international influences of our democracy that benefit everyone. Hopefully, candidates will employ popular democracy, truly representing policies and populaces in all of their complexity, rather than populism's mere symbolic and faux moral representations of an imaginary people. Thank you.
I was wondering what maybe some of the common ways today that we see the modern discontent, especially among sort of industrialized populations with globalization, is kind of via protests, or are there other mechanisms kind of at work that we can sort of observe day to day?
So the question is, what are the, sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak up too. I was wondering what some of the common ways today are that we sort of see this modern discontent with globalization, especially in industrialized countries like the US or those of the European Union.
So my lecture has tried to show its negative, unfortunately, its negative outbursts, which is an electorate that is angry and that is therefore easily susceptible to sort of listing that is engaging in fear and negative competition, right? And so that's the wrong way. So we need better communications. We need leaders to be honest. That's what I've tried to say. Leaders know the truth, so they should be honest. But our communications, on social media, our media also needs to present the complexity and present the truth for civil societies, societies like ours, who are the electorates, to be able to make discerning decisions in elections. Ask the right questions as well. Hopefully our media should also ask the right questions. I think that sometimes our media tends to be a horse race and follow the horse race rather than challenge both candidates on the complexities of the issues. So not doing that leaves the electorate sort of uneducated about the issues and therefore reliant on simplicities. But look, there's a lot of organizing going on. We are sort of a really beautiful democracy. Just last week shows us that our institutions are strong, that our values are strong as well, and that there is space for contestation, civil contestations. So even when we think, oh my goodness, this policy, so bad, you see there's an opposition to it, right? And that the political system is working itself through. It doesn't always come as soon as it could, but it's working. It's working through. So I'm sort of confident that just keep pushing through.
Thank you. Anyone's also welcome. Any questions from the audience?
Billy talked about how, I guess, Trump and part of his political strategy was to, in some sense, mobilize the working class against professional, what's it called?
Professional managerial class, yes.
Do you think that's something he actually believes, or is that just a political strategy?
That's full of paradoxes. I named my my lecture paradoxes. Does he believe it? Does he believe that? No, I don't think he does. I think it's a strategy. He, as a populist, sort of uses it strategically because he knows it works. And so, I think it's more complex. So, I wish I could maybe have a one-on-one with you and talk about some evolution of where we are today and how sort of classes have formed and how factions have formed and broken away and evolved. I mean, the former left, has now become the sort of right wing. I mean, how did that happen and what were the issues? What are the grievances? There's a lot going on, and so I think Trump is also sort of product of that as well. He used to be a Democrat, right? He shifted to the Republican Party. Did you feel that he wasn't getting a lot of play with the Democrats, or was he just tired of being criticized by what he saw as the sort of PC, of the Democrats, and wanted to be freer to be able to, act, and speak unilaterally. There's a lot of that as well, right? But I think mostly once he saw it worked, it works. He uses it strategically. But I don't think he, believes all he says about, these things. Although, this first 5 days, he didn't believe that he would. We believed he would do the mass deportation. This DEI thing that he's doing, that's a bit, that's shaking up. People are saying, well, perhaps there should have been some more complexity, towards approaching, that issue, rather than just sort of, de-establish it, right? So I'm not sure what's going on there.
Do you think that the Democrat Party should go back to working class by the 2028 election? And if so, what strategies do you think would be successful in this issue?
So I think the Democratic Party will
win over the working class.
Well, they're having their Democratic National Committee elections next week, and there's about 4 or or 5 candidates, and all of them are speaking to this issue, that the failure for the Democrats was their inability to reach working classes, and so each of the candidates I've listened to has said that that is what they intend to do. There is another part of the party, however, who believes that this is a failed thesis. It's not true that Democrats do well with working classes. It's just that, Democrats are not willing to play a faux populism with working classes, right? It is true that they approach working classes with a bit more, they're willing to do the America First, and so they have, criticize trade policies and are willing to be anti-globalist as well. But I think the problem is that they also, they communicate that, but, when they go behind the scenes, they realize that some of these things are not possible, and so that gets them in trouble, right? So they're doing a lot of soul searching. I do believe that, the Democrats can win again, soon. But I think, the whole working class issue is a complex one.
So I'm sort of wondering how broadly generalizable this thesis is, because in 2024, we saw in pretty much every country that had an election, the incumbents lost seats or lost votes in some way. And the sort of country that comes to mind is India, where you have Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is this sort of right-wing populist, and his party lost their parliamentary majority. So it seemed like it didn't quite work there. So what do you think of that?
I cited it as a country that India was cited in this global populism. So the global populism survey of countries, let me even go back to this slide. These are all the countries that in 2024 claim to have lost some part of their political system, not always the president. And so in India, what happened is that the Modi's majority, slid a bit, right? As a result of this. And so, the Global Populist Survey is claiming that this is, the same trend, right? Even the British elections, which brought to power a progressive Labour Party, right? Global populism puts it in the same trend. I'm not so sure, that this is all just sort of working classes, but one thing that they all do have in common is that they're claiming that economic issues are what is driving change requests by the voters, right? So it's economic issues, and it's economic issues that are driven by post-pandemic inflation and trends in the world economy. And so part of my lecture's thesis is not just the working class. The working class issue is manifest in different countries according to their own socioeconomic conditions differently, right? But what is, I think correct in my thesis is that there's something going on in the global economy. The global economy, globalization in the early 1990s, millennium was, especially, strong for Western democracies, but post-financial crisis, post-2008, we began to experience something called hyper-globalization, and certainly a loss of manufacturing jobs in Western liberal democracies, especially in the United States. And so Western liberal democracies began to backlash against the economy or globalization, the world economy. And I feel that no politician is really facing that question honestly to their electorates. All right, thank you.
All right, thank you again, Dr. Dizzy, for your insights into global democracy, globalization. Next up, we have Dr. Jeffrey Mirren. Jeffrey Mirren is Senior Lecturer, Director of Undergraduate Studies, and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Economics at Harvard University. He is also the Vice President for Research at the Cato Institute. Dr. Mirren has a Bachelor of Arts from Swarthmore College and a PhD in Economics from MIT. Dr. Mirren's commentary on economic policy has appeared on CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, NPR, Bloomberg, Fox, BBC, and dozens of other television, radio, and print media around the world. Dr. Mirren's area of expertise is the economics of libertarianism. He has written extensively against drug prohibition. Dr. Mirren is also a star teacher. The senior class at Harvard has 11 times chosen him as one of its favorite teachers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Mirren.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for having me.
It's just the computer, you can just press the next, yeah.
Okay. So my topic is a particular perspective, a libertarian perspective on economic, social, and foreign policy. And much of the issues about the election and current politics in the U.S. will certainly come up, although I intend it to be a somewhat broader conversation. So my goal is to present this particular perspective on the following question. What is the appropriate size and scope of government? And I'm going to emphasize that. Okay? What should government do? Okay? Because I think that's a useful lens on a huge fraction of the debates that current society and all societies debate and go through and are at the heart of the controversies and the unhappiness. So when should governments intervene? Via taxes, via regulation, via subsidies, via mandates, via whatever particular policy regarding economic issues, social issues, foreign policy issues. And in the framework that I'll present, it doesn't matter so much which particular topic we're talking about. We're going to think about the consequences of interventions. And the crucial thing that unifies them all is their government interventions that interfere in the private workings of society. So this question that I'm talking about is, of course, a question that's been addressed forever. Economists, political scientists, politicians, philosophers, and people, by citizens. And views differ quite widely. How big should government be? Where should it take a stand? Where should it interfere or not? There are roughly, in the US and most other countries at the moment, two main views that we call liberalism and conservatism. You'll see those labels are potentially a little misleading, but they're useful as a starting point. The liberal perspective, here I mean the modern liberal perspective, not 19th century classical liberalism. There's confusion because of that previous use of the perspective of liberalism. The modern liberal perspective says government should intervene a lot on economic issues. Regulations, taxes, redistribution, but roughly speaking, liberals think the government should intervene much less on social and foreign policy issues. And the conservative perspective is approximately the reverse, intervene much less on economics things, but much more on social and foreign policy issues, such as prohibiting drugs, taking a stand on diversity and inclusion, and things like that. And as I mentioned, the reality of what is currently a set of views in the perspective of people who call themselves conservatives is not exactly what I just described. For example, conservatives advocate all sorts of crony capitalism, of government support of some industries relative to others and things like that, which is not consistent with the way I try to characterize it. But they would claim that they're in favor of free markets and less intervention, and historically have somewhat more in that direction. I'm going to present an alternative perspective that says we should have very little government across the board, no matter what issue it is, whether the purpose of that government policy is to promote a liberal view, a conservative view, or anything else. There should basically be relatively almost no government intervention. The name for that perspective is libertarianism, or historically was called classical liberalism. And that view has a long history, certainly goes back several centuries, but it has not been widely held. Indeed, maybe it's never been widely held, but I still think, I'll try to convince you that it's a perspective that's worth thinking about and understanding, even if you don't agree. So I'm going to try to explain that to you. I'm not especially going to advocate for the libertarian view, but I am a libertarian. Of course, I can't but help to be somewhat supportive of the libertarian perspective. So take everything I say with an appropriate grain of salt. But I'd really like to simply convince you that libertarianism is different and it's interesting. And of course, you decide. So I'll first talk about what I'll call consequential versus philosophical libertarianism. There are two main flavors of this perspective. Then I'm going to briefly do an analysis of a bunch of particular policy issues to illustrate that the libertarian perspective is at a minimum very different from either the liberal or conservative perspective. If I have time, I'll talk about, is there a clock somewhere telling me? I can just use my,
Sorry.
I can just use my phone, that's fine. So I don't run too far over. If I have time, I'll talk about what's known as a federalist perspective. Even if you buy libertarianism, it doesn't necessarily tell you which policies you would accept at the state or local level versus the national level. And then I'll come back again if I have time to explain, talk about the consequential versus the philosophical perspective. Okay, so as I mentioned, libertarianism comes in two main flavors, referred to as philosophical. Philosophical is also sometimes referred to as rights-based libertarianism, or if you really want to be hoity-toity, you can call it deontological libertarianism. That's in opposition to what I call consequential, or sometimes economic libertarianism, cost-benefit libertarianism. The philosophical view simply asserts that individuals have rights. Often called natural rights, but that's just spin. That's to try to make them seem more appealing. It asserts that individuals have rights, and it says policy should never infringe on any of those rights. Philosophical libertarian view then notes that essentially all policies do infringe someone's rights in some way, shape, or form, not to the same degree. Some might infringe your individual liberty much more than other policies. But still, since almost all policies infringe on individual freedom or individual rights, in the philosophical view, almost all policies are undesirable because they limit people's freedom. Now, there are, of course, are lots of people who find the philosophical perspective appealing. The most famous person, perhaps, was Ayn Rand, or alternatively, you might say Milton Friedman. Ronald Reagan was sometimes characterized as a libertarian, although I think that's a seriously sort of inaccurate. Okay? But my experience is if you don't already share the philosophical libertarian view, having it be asserted and presented to you isn't going to convince you. Because the philosophical approach contains no rational arguments or evidence. It's an assertion. Okay? It almost feels like a religion. It's not going to do anything to convince you to think that way if you didn't already. So I am a consequentialist. That's, of course, the natural thing for an economist to be, is a consequentialist, to think about what are the effects, what are the costs and benefits of different policies, and I'll try to then relate the two perspectives. So what does consequential libertarianism mean? It says that when we're considering policy interventions, by interventions I mean all the kinds of policies governments do, taxes to regulation, mandates, and so on. When we're thinking about those, we should ask a set of questions. What's the problem that the intervention allegedly fixes? Because if you don't have a clear sense of what the problem is that you're trying to fix, you're probably not going to do a very good job at targeting the intervention. Is the problem large or small? Almost all interventions have some cost, so if it's a small problem, maybe it doesn't make sense to even think about an intervention. Will private mechanisms ameliorate these problems that you think you've identified, at least if given time and the government stays out? If policy does intervene, what are the possible ways? Think about the range of things government can do. Say, with respect to drugs, you could simply have government give warning messages, or you could have government impose a moderate sin tax. You could have time and place use restrictions. You could have minimum purchase ages, or you could go much farther and outright prohibit the substances in question. Okay? So maybe it's useful to think about the range of things and whether some of those policies have better ratios of cost to benefits than others. You should, of course, ask whether the intervention that you're proposing will actually reduce the problem in question. argue a little bit later on that often that's not the case. If it will reduce the problem some, how much? Is that really enough to justify the cost? And then, of course, you should always ask, what do these interventions cost? Okay? Politicians like to think they can just pass a law and everything will be hunky-dory. Okay? But in fact, for policies to have real impact, we might have to take steps to implement them, to enforce them. So we could ask about those costs. And in particular, and this is a huge thing for libertarians, what are the unintended consequences? What are all the ways in which the policies might affect people in society in ways that are different than what you intended, what you were trying to accomplish with that particular policy? So then consequential libertarianism says that if you thought through all these questions, you should intervene if, but only if, you're pretty confident that the overall consequences from intervening, from having an active policy, are better than choosing the policy of non-intervention, which is often referred to as laissez-faire. Similarly, if you're comparing two policies, you would choose policy A over policy B if, having thought through these questions, you thought the range of consequences was better than policy A versus policy B. Now, the way I've described it, maybe the natural thing for you to be thinking is consequential libertarianism is just cost-benefit analysis with a broad view of costs and benefits. So standard cost-benefit analysis that you might learn in economics or accounting class would only talk about things that you could quantify, that you could measure, that you could convert into dollars. But in fact, libertarians and most people think there are other consequences of policies that are worth thinking about. Maybe having aggressive policies in some areas that everybody violates erodes the rule of law, the spirit of compliance, and that spills over the way people behave about other policies. Okay? So you can certainly recognize that there are many non-monetary hard-to-measure effects of policies. Okay? But still, the framework I'm proposing is essentially cost-benefit analysis. You might then want to say that, as with cost-benefit analysis, consequential libertarianism is not going to lead everyone to exactly the same conclusions. Because it's perfectly reasonable for different people put different weights on the different consequences of intervening. Some people care, especially say, about increasing the size of the economic pie. So there's more total for everyone. Okay? Other people care much more about how the economic pie gets divided up and are willing to have a smaller economic pie if it's divided the same way. Okay? So people have different value systems for weighting the full range of costs and benefits. And of course, they have, in many cases, different assessments of the magnitude of these different effects. Classic examples of the minimum wage law. There are literally thousands of studies of the effect of the minimum wage on unemployment. Some of them find negative effects, as predicted by standard economics. A few of them find positive effects. Some of them find very little effects. So you can reasonably have different opinions. And so that might lead you to think that this perspective I presented, this consequentialist cost-benefit perspective, isn't really ever going to have much bite. It's not going to really dictate anything, because reasonable people, given their different value systems and assessments of the evidence, can always disagree to justify kind of any conclusion. I'm going to claim further, however, or at least libertarians believe further, however, that in a broad range of cases, reasonable views of the pros and cons from intervention suggest that the negatives far outweigh the positive. So less intervention is usually better. This is an empirical claim. It's not a theorem. I'm saying that my assessment of libertarians' assessment is when you look at all of these effects, you're going to find, if you're consistent, much more cost relative to benefit than the advocates of these policies from the left or the right talk about. And so you're going to end up thinking that when you do the approach I described, you're going to come down in favor of much smaller. So let me give some examples. These are examples were chosen to try to give you the full range and make clear that the consequentialist libertarianism is neither left nor right. It's very different, fundamentally different from either of the standard perspectives. So drug legalization. Most countries ban a range of currently illegal drugs, such as marijuana, cocaine, etc. Libertarians argue they should all be legal, not just marijuana, literally every drug. The standard argument for prohibition says that drug use causes serious harm, both to users and perhaps to others, say, driving under the influence. And the claim argues that prohibition reduces use of these banned substances and the associated harms. Consequentialism paints a different picture. First, point out that neither theory nor evidence suggests that prohibition has a major effect on the amount of drug use or associated harms. There's probably an effect in that direction, probably outlawing these substances reduces their use, but neither theory nor evidence suggests a big effect. Some of the reduction in use caused by prohibition should probably be interpreted as a cost. If prohibition prevents someone who can smoke marijuana in their home on a Saturday night without driving under the influence, without operating heavy machinery, and it makes them happier to smoke the marijuana, that's their business. That's a benefit of drug use, not a cost. And so that should be recognized as well. So some of the alleged benefit from reducing drug use is unresolved. Excuse me, in any case, the alleged benefit is modest. In addition, prohibition is likely to generate a large range of negative side effects. Prohibition increases violence. It creates an underground market. Underground market, people resolve their disputes with guns because they can't resolve their disputes with lawyers. Generates more income-generating crime by raising drug prices. So drug users are more incentivized to steal and so on in order to be able to afford their drug habits. Prohibition reduces quality control of drugs because you don't have standard mechanisms that make sure that when you buy a bottle of Advil in CVS, it's Advil. It's almost never a poison. There have been cases where Advil was poisoned because some crazy person did it, but it's a 1 in a zillion thing. Whereas underground markets, you have no idea from whom you're buying. You have no idea, you have no recourse if in fact you were sold inappropriately adulterated or excessively pure drugs. And that's the reason we have an opioid crisis, because people are not buying these substances over the counter where they know what they're getting. They're buying them from dealers on street corners and things like that. Prohibition generates corruption because people want to try to get around the laws that are being imposed. It disrupts other countries that are the manufacturer of sources of many drugs. There's limitations on the medical use of marijuana and opioids because of prohibition. And as examples of intangible effects of policies that are hard to measure, there's disrespect for the law, because almost everyone realizes a lot of people violate the drug laws and almost all of them get away with it. So then that makes people who, whether you use or not, think, gee, laws are for suckers. I might as well disobey the laws that I don't like, because these other people are disobeying the laws that they don't like and getting away with it. Okay? Plus, of course, the direct cost of enforcement, which in the US is probably $50 to $100 billion. So consequential libertarianism says, even if policymakers are concerned about the negatives of drug use, legalization is still the better policy because the negatives of prohibition are greater than any plausible value of potential benefits. That analysis is not going to convince everyone, but it's a good illustration of why I argue that focusing on the consequences, or why the consequences perspective, might be useful and get people to talk about which aspects of the analysis they agree on and which they don't, and therefore maybe into some of that policy. Okay, second example, and it deliberately comes right after drug prohibition, is the libertarians oppose most forms of gun control. And I should have said, to be a little clearer, especially would oppose prohibitions, outright bans on guns, but even more so than relatively mild regulation. Philosophical libertarians base their view, or they say they base their view, on assertions about rights or about the Second Amendment to the Constitution. But in fact, almost all libertarians would oppose gun control even if the Second Amendment didn't exist. So that's not really the issue in question. Instead, consequentialists will argue that controls are unlikely to generate beneficial effects that outweigh the harmful effects of controlling or regulating. The potential benefit is reduced violence or other crime. Okay? And of course, almost everyone would agree that that would be a benefit. But common sense and a large body of formal evidence suggest that the people who have bad motivations, who are going to do bad things with guns, that often or even usually avoid regulations and controls, by buying guns in the black market, by making guns with 3D printers, and all sorts of things. And also, consequential perspective notes, just as with drugs, that gun control generates harm. It inconveniences people who want to own and use guns without harming anyone else. It increases violence by creating an underground trade, just as driving drugs underground creates an underground trade that will then be violent. Okay? And it distracts attention from more effective policies. Policy most likely to reduce violence will be legalizing drugs rather than trying to further control guns. Okay? So, of course, reasonable people can still be in favor of some kinds of controls. You know, purchase ages, you can't buy a gun unless you're at least 18 and things like that. But framing the debate into consequential terms suggests what would need to be true for those controls to actually be beneficial. Libertarians see the evidence as against controls, and it's particularly against outright bans. But of course, other people see it. Different topic, same-sex marriage. First of all, what is a marriage? It's a contract. And it's a contract between the state, people getting married, their kids, and so on. By supplying marriage, government is providing a service to opposite-sex couples, traditionally, until relatively recently, and it enforces that particular contract. In fact, there's no good reason, based on consequences, rather than religious views, for limiting this service to opposite-sex couples. Why? First, libertarians tend to argue that government should provide marriage to no one. There should be no government marriage at all. Let people who want this particular contract go to a lawyer, write up that particular contract with some of the characteristics of current marriages, but not necessarily exactly the same features. The government would enforce that contract, but in the same way it enforces all of the contracts. Similarly, libertarians would be fine with civil unions for everyone. Then the government never needs to use the word marriage. One thing that was interesting about the same-sex marriage debate was that two sides agreed on one thing. They agreed that it was substantially about the word marriage. Okay? People who wanted same-sex marriages provided legally didn't want to be told, you can have civil unions when opposite-sex couples get marriages. They wanted to be treated the same as everyone else. So if everyone had been called civil unions, maybe that would have been okay. They didn't want to be given what would have seemed like a second-class version. And people who were against same-sex marriage were upset because they thought of marriage as having specific religious implications and things like that, and didn't want it to be used for something that they didn't approve. But if you went to this direction of calling everything civil unions, then you could avoid the debate. Consequentialism says, what would be the consequences of legalizing same-sex marriage? Self-evidently, many couples would benefit because they want to have such marriages. They're, in fact, spend substantial time, energy, and resources trying to convince people that the government should provide same-sex marriages. There is no evidence anywhere from any social science literature or medical literature or anything like that anyone is harmed by the existence of same-sex marriage. Indeed, several papers in economics journals suggesting clear benefits from the provision of same-sex marriage. So government has no basis for discriminating in favor of one group or the other. That's separate from the question of what level of government should address the marriage issue. We might have time to come back to that. Okay, so as you might have guessed, I've sort of deliberately gone back and forth between sort of lefty libertarian views and more conservative or right-wing libertarian views. So now I'll go back in a more free market-y, sort of right-wing group, and talk about Medicare. Medicare provides subsidized health insurance for the elderly. And most people view that as a worthy goal. Of course, everybody would like to get subsidized health insurance. Consequentialism argues, however, that this good intention has substantial costs and undesired effects. Some of these are inevitable, some can be reduced substantially in a modified system. So what do I mean? If government subsidizes health insurance, it affects the market for healthcare. It increases the demand for healthcare because it's being subsidized. That increases government expenditure on this healthcare, and that then leads to attempts to control prices and ration the quantity of healthcare, death panels, and the like, because healthcare expenditure, government healthcare expenditure, is growing at a rate that's not sustainable. It's going to bankrupt the economy. Okay? Price controls and rationing generate substantial efficiencies and make the healthcare system much less effective. Medicare could dampen those effects by phasing in two things: higher age of eligibility, given that life expectancy has increased by about 10 years since Medicare was created. Medicare was created in 1965. Or if it's based in a substantially higher deductible, okay, so that more people's health care had to be paid out of pocket before the insurance kicked in. Either approach would reduce the subsidized demand, the degree of subsidy, and that would help restrain costs. A higher deductible is especially important. Insurance, to economists, is supposed to be for large, unexpected events, not all purchases. No one buys homeowners insurance to cover the cost of mowing their grass, or auto insurance to cover the cost of changing your oil. You buy insurance, okay, to deal with risk of very large, big negative outcomes. Okay? So Medicare is currently far more expansive than necessary to accomplish the key goal of providing catastrophic care insurance to the recipients, to the elderly. Okay? So libertarians would, at a minimum, scale back Medicare. Okay, again, switching back to an area where libertarians sided much more with the left than with the right, the invasion of Iraq. Advocates for that invasion and subsequent occupation made three claims. One, they said it was self-defense for the United States because Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which might have been a threat to the U.S. or allies like Israel. Second, they claimed it was humanitarian to intervene because deposing Saddam would help the Iraqis. Third, they claimed it would be good nation building because it would establish democracy and peace in the Middle East. Libertarians certainly agree that self-defense is one of the few legitimate objectives for government. And libertarians are not necessarily opposed to humanitarian or nation-building efforts if those seem likely to succeed. But there were key consequences and facts that were relevant to the decision about invading Iraq. It was not necessarily in Iraq's interest to use the weapons of mass destruction. It was very unlikely they would ever really do so, even if you believe that they had them. Subsequent searching throughout the country showed they in fact did not have them, and there was never any good evidence that they had them. There was clearly risks of bad outcomes from invading, like the ethnic violence that ensued was substantial. So the rosy scenarios we painted of what would happen if we invaded were hopeful at best, based on past experience and common sense. Some advocates still believe the invasion was a success, but I think libertarians would argue they're taking a skewed view of what happened. We had hundreds of billions of dollars in direct cost. There were tens of thousands of deaths and injuries of Americans and Iraqis. Increased alienation of the Middle East as a result of our intervention. There's, if anything, been a much less stable Middle East, sort of very broadly. And there's been, if anything, a tenuous improvement in the economy of the governments in Iraq. Mainly, we replaced one dictator with a different corrupt dictator under U.S. sort of indirect control. Iraq is still sort of affected by violence, corruption, and so on. So libertarians are opposed to the vast majority of military interventions abroad. And I wouldn't want to say zero, but very, very few, almost certainly none of the ones that have occurred. So what are other policies and interventions that libertarians would shrink or eliminate? And I'm just going to name these in the interest of time. Rent control and minimum wage laws, occupational safety and health regulation, agricultural subsidies, energy subsidies, which exist for both green energy and non-green energy. On net, probably making things, probably encouraging more use of fossil fuel in the way that the current subsidies exist. Government protection for unions. Not that libertarians would oppose unions. The government should take no side on no stand on either side for or against unions. We would oppose macroeconomic stabilization policy, oppose housing subsidies, which exist for both rich and poor, depending on exactly which policy you're talking about. And then last but not least, tying things a little bit to the previous discussion, and certainly a lot of the conversation now about policy, libertarians are adamantly in favor of unrestricted free trade, unilateral free trade. Okay? The U.S. should simply eliminate all of its tariff and other trade barriers, full stop, whether or not we can convince other countries to match or go. Likewise, the libertarian ideal is open borders for immigration. They're not silly enough mostly to think it will likely happen, but there's a huge range to expand legal immigration, move in the direction of open borders, relative to where policy is. And libertarians think that probably the best policy is liberal. I'm okay on time. So let me talk briefly about libertarian federalism. Given that I've proposed thinking about policies in an empirical way, it's inevitable reasonable people are going to disagree. They clearly do disagree, even amongst libertarians. There's a range of perspective on some issues. So libertarians, the right way to adjudicate almost all of those differences of opinion is to leave almost everything to state governments. That is, the federal government would do almost nothing except national defense. Okay? And everything else, including all the policies that I discussed that libertarians don't like, would be available to states to enact if they wanted, but not imposed on them. So we'll get the federal government out, but still let states adopt policies, even policies that libertarians don't want. Now, as a resident of any given state, libertarians would still argue against policies that they thought were misguided, such as rent control, but there would be no federal restriction on the ability of states to adopt those policies. So how do you think about that? Well, if each state can adopt its own policies, you're going to get variety, you're going to get innovation. To some degree, the good policies will get imitated, the bad ones will tend to die out. Different states will accommodate somewhat different views. Okay? There's clearly heterogeneity in people's views, and people tend to sort of aggregate with other people who tend to be like themselves. So there'll be some sorting of people according to their views. The state will have to worry about adopting policies that are too generous. You could think that on many of the issues libertarians don't like, maybe what we really don't like is the policies have gotten out of hand. And a very mild version of the policy maybe would be okay. When we observe that slopes are slippery, a little bit of the policy ends up becoming a very interventionist or a very generous or a very expensive policy. Okay? Leaving things to the states might help to counter that, because each state has to say, gee, if we have a really generous unemployment insurance system, a lot of unemployed people are going to move into our state. We have a moderate unemployment insurance system. Maybe that's a reasonable balance. We have really strong environmental regulation. We're going to drive all the industry out of our state. If we have moderate environmental regulation, maybe we get some reasonable balance. So this competition across states, in principle, can help moderate the tendency of policies to expand too much. In particular, what other people would worry about is that when you leave things to the state, you would get a race to the bottom. And every state would say, oh, we're going to abandon our social safety net because we don't want all the poor people coming to our state to take advantage of our social safety net. Okay? That doesn't seem to happen. It seems that most states are at least moderately altruistic. States, long before there was Social Security, adopted relatively stingy, but still did adopt Social Security policies, Medicaid type policies, and things like that. So it seems that states will provide some of these things, which plausibly make sense if done in moderation, okay, rather than having a race to the bottom. So here's some examples. Okay, I have an anti-poverty expenditure I just talked about. Okay. Education, okay, which illustrates a different theme in a lot of libertarian discussion. If the federal government does something, okay, if any level of government does something, but especially if the federal government does something, it's going to tend to impose one view everywhere. Impose policies about sex education, impose policies about transgender policies, impose one view about diversity, equity, inclusion, things like that. Those policies clearly create some degree of polarization for good and for maybe for some good and some bad reasons. When they're done at the federal level, scope for them to alienate people, to create a Donald Trump, support for Donald Trump seems to be extreme. If all those policies were left to the state, then individual states would have a range of policies as to whether they taught sex education to seventh graders and things like that. Maybe that would allow for a range of reasonable views to coexist, because people would not feel as much that they were being forced to adopt a different perspective, to live under a perspective they didn't. Okay? An incredibly important example of this issue is probably abortion. It's clear that most people in the country don't want abortion outright banned, but there is enough support for those bans in some states. Right? Those states have adopted very strict bans. So the libertarian view would be, libertarians differ in what they think about abortion, but they would all agree there should be no federal policy that outlaws it everywhere and no federal policy that mandates it everywhere. Individual states will do what they want, and that should allow some degree of peaceful coexistence. Now, personally, I'm strongly sort of pro-choice, okay, and So the other thing I think is good about this leading into the states is, de facto, that will lead to close to legalization almost everywhere, because the abortion bill, RU46, can be literally put in an envelope and shipped to anyone with an address anywhere in the country. It's just physically impossible for the government to prevent the widespread distribution and use of RU46. So as long as the federal government is not criminalizing that, which of course it is trying to do in some ways, as long as it's not doing that, de facto abortion will be legal for a very, very broad subset. Same-sex marriage is an interesting case. You could argue that the same-sex marriage case should be left in the same way as the way I described abortion policy. That is, let every state choose its own policy about marriage, which is exactly about same-sex marriage, which is exactly what was true about each state's policy about marriage. The Supreme Court decision didn't do that. The Supreme Court decision went farther than legalized same-sex marriage and said every state has to supply same-sex marriages. That's probably going to end up being challenged under this current administration. The current justices might actually try to roll that back, and maybe we'll go farther. Partially, I think, because the decision in favor of same-sex marriage in Obergefell in 2015 went farther than it needed to. Could have just left everything to each state government, and that would have again reduced the pressure, the pushback, the polarization. I mentioned this briefly. That's sort of implied by the anti-poverty discussion. National defense is the one policy where libertarians agree. It should, of course, be conducted at the federal level. And then trade policy. So the libertarian hope is that this kind of federalism leads to less contention. People feel strongly can migrate to states with policies they like. Even the people who don't want to move can take some comfort that there is a state that adopts the policies that they like. Okay? And so maybe the polarization and acrimony will be lower and much less than when these policies are imposed. Okay, so just about done. Let me talk about philosophical versus consequential libertarianism again, just for just a second. So it turns out, even though I described them as being very different, one is a bunch of assertions about rights, the other is allegedly careful and thorough cost-benefit analysis, but they come to all the same conclusions. Okay? So there must be something going on that leads to that. The natural explanation is simply that the philosophical principles turn out to be very useful rules of thumb. They're an easy way to summarize the judgment that when government intervenes, it's likely to create unintended consequences because it has to use force, has to interfere with people's lives to impose its policies, okay? And that's going to generate various reactions that they make the treatment worse than the disease. When you try to coerce people into doing things, it seems likely that bad stuff will happen. Okay? So the philosophical perspective, while in and of itself, okay, maybe not super convincing, it just turns out to be a very, very good rule of thumb. So it's a different language rather than being personally, I like the consequentialist language because it's natural to economists. Another benefit of the consequentialist language is you can much more easily rank policies. To a sort of hardcore philosophical, if you had a state-level policy that banned tattoo parlors, that can have a huge negative effect on the people who live in that state. Not so much. Just going to go to the next state over, which doesn't ban tattoo parlors. In fact, Massachusetts has a ban, okay, but if you drive south on any of the non-highway roads, as you cross from Massachusetts into Rhode Island, what will you see? A bunch of stores, a bunch of establishments that offer tattoo services. Okay, so that policy, while silly, is not going to have a huge negative effect. Whereas banning marijuana nationwide has the potential for huge negative effects. The philosophical approach doesn't easily allow you to distinguish those cases and talk about which policies are really bad and which are just sort of bad. Similarly, the consequentialist approach makes it easier to compromise. It's agree with people who have a different perspective that some amount of a social safety net is acceptable, but a hugely expensive social safety net maybe was not a good balance, even if you have somewhat different views. So, to me, the consequentialist approach is useful and it's a better approach. Okay, So consequentialism says we should be rational, we should look at the evidence, and in particular, we should consider unintended as well as the intended consequences when evaluating policies. The claim is that if you do that, the analysis supports small government rather than big government very, very broadly. It opposes almost all the policies that conservatives want to oppose, and it opposes almost all the policies that liberals want to oppose. Okay, so it is neither liberalism nor conservatism. It's consistent. It tries to systematically ask, is there really a problem? Does the proposed solution help, and at what cost? And it always goes in the direction of more freedom, less government expenditure, fewer government employees, fewer government rules, laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that this presentation has explained the libertarian view. I hope it's made it interesting. I, of course, have not convinced all of you. In my experience when I teach this class at Harvard is that 2 or 3 students out of several hundred will come and say, you know, when I sat through your introductory lecture, which was very similar to this lecture, I thought you were insane, but you know, of course, has a reputation for not doing too much work, so I decided to stick with it. And at the end of the class, I still think you're wrong, but maybe you're not insane. Maybe you made a few mistakes. So I hope that you feel the same way. I appreciate you. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, I just wonder, I understand the rationale of sort of the shifting power from federal to state governments. But I guess I just wonder why the state level? Why has that been the level decided to move it to? Because you would think that if you continue that logical presupposition, you would get to county, local, and ultimately to the individual. Well, why is that?
You would certainly hope as a libertarian that most states would choose to give cities and towns a broad leeway to design their school systems and their housing policies and things like that. Absolutely, what you said is exactly right. The only reason I talk about federal versus state, and there's a reasonably natural division there, is because the state is a thing in the Constitution. Okay? And there's a long history of Supreme Court cases and debates about which things states must do, which things are allowed to do. There's specific provisions about all this. At this point, it's now completely muddled. Okay? There's no consistency at all. But if you went back to an original interpretation of the Constitution, it would be very natural to say these things the federal government should not be doing at all. There's no enumerated power that says the federal government. And intermediate education is a good example. There's nothing in the powers specified for the federal government that would include giving the national system educational progress, giving subsidizing charters or vouchers or anything like that.
Do you have any examples at the top of your head of like a modern day like popular politician that takes a consequential libertarian view?
There's basically one, which is not a good sign. Well, as the second one, Gary Johnson was the governor of New Mexico. He was reelected, so he was governor for 2 terms. I was actually his economic advisor when we ran for president of the Libertarian Party platform in 2012 and 16. And so he was absolutely libertarian. He vetoed 468 bills from Congress in a row. The state legislature. The state legislature then, of course, turned around and overrode his veto because New Mexico is a very, very left-leaning state. And so it was sort of funny that they elected this hardcore libertarian. So he's one example. The other good example is Justin Amash, who was a several-term representative in Congress from a rural part of Michigan. And everybody thought he was going to be the Libertarian Party candidate in 2020. For some reason, he withdrew. No, I suspect there are a few more who, in their heart of hearts, have some sympathy, or at least lean a little bit in the direction. And it used to be William Weld, governor of Massachusetts, elected twice, but then he left during the second term. He was the vice presidential candidate for Gary Johnson, so that's not a reason. But no, they're not.
Do you think libertarianism is inherently individualistic or collectivistic?
I totally understand why people think of it as individualistic. On the other hand, it would do nothing to prevent any kind of communal arrangement. If people wanted to live in kibbutzes, if they want to voluntarily have communities where everybody it's supposed to obey the same religion or share the same schools. You're of course totally free to do that in libertarian. So we don't think it's pushing people to not interact or not be social or anything like that. But yes, it is often described as people who are individualistic in very standard ways seem to be more than open to libertarians. People who don't like being. Yes.
I'm curious, are there any policies that libertarians agree on where more federal power would be better, or is it like every single policy they agree on?
Relative to where we now are now, I can't think of it. I mean, if you think about the US government in 1790, one of my one-liners is, immigrants want to repeal all government enacted since the 90s. We mean since the 1790s. But even in the 1790s, we adopted the Alien and Sedition Act, which allows the federal government to punish people for saying things against the federal government. And it's being resurrected by guess who? So that illustrates the libertarian view that every policy you create, no matter how sensible and interesting and plausible and small it sounds when you enact it, sooner or later it's going to be resurrected to do something very different and much more evil than its original purpose.
I have a question. It's actually on two specific, one's policy, one's the agency, that you brought up or at least mentioned in some regards. One of them was OSHA. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that because at least in my mind, I can understand like the benefits, the costs of that. And the other one is the Food and Drug Administration, is eventually legalizing.
Okay, OSHA is really simple. It imposes safety rules on businesses, roughly speaking. Libertarian view is that people will choose more versus less dangerous jobs on their own. And if they only want to take a certain job, if the employer takes certain safety measures, the marketplace will tend to take care of that. And if you impose it by government, you'll end up imposing a lot of costs, and you'll be excessively safe in various ways. And there won't be the right balance between the safety and cost minimization. I wouldn't actually say OSHA is far from the worst thing the policy government has, because basically OSHA mandates that companies do a lot of things they would probably do anyway because of the label. The FDA is a totally different story. Libertarians hate the FDA. We know the FDA libertarian because it raises the cost of introducing new medicines enormously. And so even if it keeps some bad medicines, that is medicines that don't actually work or that have some unanticipated side effect that doesn't emerge right away, even if it prevents a few of those from getting on the market, it prevents a ton of beneficial drugs from getting on the market as quickly. So a bunch of people are harmed while they're waiting for the 5 or 10 or 15 years of FDA approval. A really good illustration of that is you have a drug that's been approved by the FDA equivalent of like 5 OECD countries, France, Germany, Australia, Japan, etc. It's been used in those countries for 5 or 10 years. You would think that for such a drug, the FDA would say, yes, you can market it in the United States. But no, the FDA makes the manufacturer who wants to sell in the United States go through new trials all over again, further delaying access for people who are sick to those medications which, based on a huge amount of evidence, seem to be beneficial relative to their potential risks. And another thing that's interesting is the existence of the FDA may end up being one way that the anti-abortion forces try to close down abortions by forcing the FDA to reverse its approval of RU46, the abortion pill. Okay? And then that would drive that market underground. May or may not reduce the number of abortions very much because of the thriving black market on RU46, as there was before it was legalized by the FDA. But if you put power into a government agency, it might get used for things that you had never even thought about or anticipated at the time of creating the government. Yeah.
Could you please elaborate for us how you see libertarian agenda enacted in the context of international relations? So, let me elaborate. According to the libertarian agenda, the state would receive a bit less taxes, would be able to execute a bit less violence on its territory, would be able to control its population a bit less, because will be less informational security, etc., etc. But that is only in the United States. But wouldn't this decrease the influence of the United States compared to China or compared to European Union or other countries by making the state less of an agent, by making the state less of a powerful agent? You do not decrease the power of other states that will be execute influence. How to solve
I'm
the
not
problem?
quite sure I got the full question. Let me say 2 or 3 quick things. First, libertarian view does suggest that the U.S. should have a huge amount of interaction with the rest of the world by trade and immigration, not by sending military troops and missiles and things like that in, and killing people and blowing things up, trying to install one government relative to another government, doing a huge amount of damage in most cases in the process. So, in the libertarian land, the government would have. Does that answer your question?
I mean,
Or does it address your question?
yes, but if ideally, yes, this is how it should work. We should trade and allow for free integration. But if we put this picture into reality of the modern world, how does it address
Well, I
the issues
mean,
that we have today?
Why can't we be Switzerland?
Because US is much bigger than Switzerland. And
This means we
located on
would not have
different
fought the Vietnam War, we wouldn't have intervened and entered World War I. I mean, you could tell a story about World War I that had we not intervened, the resulting outcome between Germany and the UK in particular might have been much less one-sided. Maybe the UK wouldn't have been able to impose these severe reparations on Germany. Maybe the absence of the severe reparations would have prevented the rise of Hitler. Maybe World War II would have never happened and not. I mean, you just don't know all the horrible things and the direct things that we do observe. War in Vietnam, it killed 50,000 Americans, plus zillions of Vietnamese. Okay? So what examples are there of military intervention that we can point to where it's pretty clear that we did more good than harm? Maybe you can come up with one, but not, I don't think very many. So if we're big and we have military might to defend ourselves if we're attacked, we should still almost never use it. That's the libertarian.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tell me when I should stop. One more.
So it's funny that you mentioned social because when you were explaining what federalist libertarianism was, that's where my mind first jumped to with its system of 26 cantons. So I really wanted to ask, in the broader context of the 190 plus countries in the world, do you see any other governments that are sort of leaning towards liberalism, or is the world as a whole just more like the United States?
There's a whole set of analyses, mainly by libertarians, trying to rank countries by how much economic or moral or whatever freedom they have. Their ability to do so, I think, is sort of noisy. It's hard to know exactly what the right measure is. Based on those measures, the U.S. comes out about number 20. New Zealand comes out first. Okay? But if you go to New Zealand, they have a lot of policies that at first order similar to those in the United States. If you look at the top 50 or so countries in that list, they're all first order, have basic religious freedoms, freedom of the press, etc. So they're mainly capitalist with lots of government tinkering here and there. So I'm not quite sure how. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Merritt. And there will be some more time during our panel discussion, also afterwards, to interact and ask some questions, because I know that there were some. Now to introduce our final keynote speaker. Lisa DeRalphos is a Senior Policy and Communications Associate at J. Powell Global, where she conducts policy outreach and evidence synthesis on the political economy and governance sector. She also supports global strategic communication and media engagement across sectors and regional offices to promote evidence-informed policymaking. Before joining JPAL in 2022, Lisa served as a Fulbright English teaching assistant in Columbia and worked on state and federal policy for the mayor of Los Angeles. Lisa graduated from the University of Southern California with degrees in economics and international relations. Please join me in welcoming Lisa DeRalphos.
It's totally off. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry.
This one should be much bigger with me what happens with the rest of the slides. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Really happy to be here, and thanks everybody for sticking around through all of these talks. I'm really excited to hear your questions and the discussion we'll have later. So I'm here to talk about different strategies and approaches to strengthening the quality of elections, not just in the United States, but abroad. And the approach that I'm going to take is going to start off with an explanation of what we do at JPAL, which stands for the Abdullah Teach Meal Poverty Action Lab. And then I'll go into some of the evidence we have and key takeaways before we discuss them a little bit more. So the approach that JPAL takes to economics and to evaluating policies focuses on randomized evaluations. So this is kind of just a scientific approach to addressing policy challenges and understanding the impacts of policies. So you might have heard of, say, pharmaceutical drug trials where you have a new drug and you want to see if it's effective. So you split a group of people into people who receive the drug and people who get the placebo, and then you can see really clearly in the data, what outcomes can be attributed to the drug versus just to the placebo. So economists have taken this same approach and applied it to social policy questions where you identify eligible participants, you randomly assign them into either a group that receives this policy intervention or a group that doesn't, and then you measure the difference in the outcomes. So take, for example, a tutoring program. You want to see, if you just applied the tutoring program to the entire group, it would be hard to know if the benefits at the end are attributed to the tutoring program or, say, students whose parents have a higher level of education or students who already learned the material before. It's hard to know how effective that policy actually was. But if you split people into two groups, one that receives the tutoring program and one that doesn't, then you know what actually was effective. So we apply this approach to research these questions in policy relevant, that are policy relevant, then we try to translate those results in ways that policymakers will understand them. I'm not sure if you've read econ papers, they're pretty hard to read and understand, especially for policymakers. So we try to work with policymakers and large nonprofits and other multinational organizations to adopt evidence so that their policies are more effective. And then we also try to make ourselves obsolete, maybe by training people to understand the use of evidence and also evaluate their own programs. We've done this all over the world. More than 2,000 studies have taken place on a variety of topics. And then we work with our regional offices to build these local partnerships. But you're not here necessarily to learn about exactly what JPAL does, although I'm happy to talk more about it later. I'm here to talk about the work that we've done to learn more about ways to improve governance. So one initiative that I work on has to do with trying to understand and answer questions that fall kind of in these three broader buckets of how can you strengthen the participation of citizens in elections and also accountability with leaders. So through lots of these different strategies to understand how you increase access to information, counter fraud in elections, empowering people to participate in politics. Then we try to fund research on strategies to fight corruption, which of course can really weaken any sort of development in government policies, and then also improving the capacity of the state to be more effective at delivering the services that it's obligated to. I guess it depends how many services, right? You think a government should be delivering, but we want it to be effective. So let's research ways to make it more effective. And today I want to focus on strengthening the quality of elections, right? We have this global context of elections, so many elections last year, and of course many more to happen this year and the years to come. And so how can we ensure that elections are meeting the needs of people and people are able to participate? So, people's votes matter, right? And that's the way that institutions can be made to represent their preferences and their needs. And so by increasing the informed participation in elections, you can have more effective governance. But there are many challenges to election equality. So I'm going to be kind of framing these different approaches through strategies to address these challenges. So one challenge that we come across is that voters lack just the relevant or the sufficient political or policy knowledge, which then makes it difficult for them to choose a candidate that meets their preferences and their needs and sort of the outcomes that they want. And this can come from either a lack of access to sufficient information. There might also be just a lack of supply of information in the context that people are in. And of course, misinformation also can really just throw a wrench into everything. Another challenge to the quality of elections is just broadly electoral fraud. So, miscounting votes, buying votes, and that shifts the incentives for politicians and candidates to use those strategies instead of campaigning on actual policy. And then they're also just less accountable to their voters if there isn't that connection between policy and the needs of voters. And then another challenge to election quality is that there's lots of but around the world, women and other marginalized groups aren't able to fully participate in the election process and also just oftentimes in politics in general. And this doesn't necessarily have to do, or it includes, of course, people who are discriminated against in the political process, but could also have to do, say, with linguistic minorities who can't, the election is carried out in one language and they speak another language, and so it's just not accessible to them, or farmers who aren't able to take time away from their crops to be able to go vote. So this kind of manifests pretty broadly. And then perhaps most consequentially is election violence. So there can be different kinds of election violence that exclude people from participating, affects election outcomes, and also encourages candidates to resort to violence in order to achieve a specific outcome. So I'm going to start off with this first challenge and dig into some of the evidence we have on approaches to improve this information question. I'm sure, in the United States here, we have a really rich information environment. So during the election last year, I'm sure you were all exposed to these many different kinds of pieces of information about taking part in the election. You saw clips of debates on social media. You received a million texts, I'm sure, about encouraging you to vote, encouraging you to encourage others to vote. Lots of different, advertisements, all of that, right? But in other parts of the world, this isn't going to always be the case, and this information just might not be accessible to lots of people. So I'm going to talk about one study that found a way to improve the access to information. This took place in Sierra Leone back in 2012 during the parliamentary elections there. And the context in Sierra Leone was, politically that people kind of voted along ethnic lines and these two historical parties. But the intervention wanted to see if filming debates between candidates and then sharing those debates through screenings and radio broadcasts would affect the decisions people made at the ballot box. And so we see results in a few different ways. So after this intervention, voters reported knowing more about these candidates for parliament and their policies, which is great. So people are now more informed about what these candidates stand for. Then, interestingly, on the candidate side, they campaigned more, so they were kind of incentivized to share their message more with their constituents or their potential constituents. Then, once we get to the ballot box, voters were more likely to vote for a candidate whose positions matched theirs, so slightly shifting the decisions people made. And then, I think this part is the most exciting part, is that after the election, these members of parliament who participated in the intervention ended up being just way more engaged with their constituencies. I think they ended up spending 2 times more on local kind of development projects, and they had like 2.5 times more meetings on town halls with their constituents. So not only were people more informed, but then government kind of became more responsive to their needs and wasn't relying on this kind of really historic kind of 2-party structure. So we've done lots of evaluations of different voter education programs, and we can kind of take some key results away from those. So information about candidates can impact who people vote for. They might, decide to vote for someone whose beliefs align more with their own. And then this can also lead to more qualified and accountable candidates being elected. And then ultimately more governance, the governance is just more responsive to people's needs and can also, provide these services more effectively. But there are also certain conditions, of course, where this isn't always the case and information can have limited or negative impact, right? Not every situation will be like that case study in Sierra Leone. So there are these cases where it can have unintended consequences. For example, voters might be unaware of the information, it just isn't reaching them, or it's not credible. We have a few studies here in Uganda and Benin and Kenya where people just didn't receive the informational flyers, for example. Or people felt that the source it was coming from, it was unfamiliar, they just didn't know if they should believe that source. Information can also confirm negative perceptions people have of government or of politicians or incumbents. So there's a series of really interesting studies in Mexico. One took place in 2009 around some mayoral elections, and it was just informing people that, this mayor is really corrupt. And people said, yeah, I know this mayor is really corrupt. I'm even, you're confirming my beliefs, so I'm even less inclined to go vote. And that led to a decrease in turnout. So less political participation, and then also no consequences for the corrupt mayors. And so then a few years later, I think in 2015, they wanted to see if the prior beliefs people held, how that impacted their decisions. And they saw that people who received information that was surprising to them, that they thought their mayors were kind of normal, and then they learned that they were actually far more corrupt, and they thought that did motivate people to go vote and punish the mayors at the ballot box. But then conversely, as before, if it was not surprising or new information to them, then they were not motivated to go vote. And then the delivery is ill-timed for the context. This one also just has to do with the way you plan interventions to make sure that they're effective. In the Philippines, I think there was like a leaflet campaign that was sent out to people, but the problem is that it was sent out really close to the election, and so then the incumbents, instead of say adjusting their strategy to address the information in the leaflets, address their policy priorities, what have you, they just relied on vote buying kind of as like a quick fix to counteract the information that was coming through these leaflets. So we can learn a lot from these kinds of studies. It's obviously can be very nuanced, and but we can still learn things like the fact that policy preferences can really transcend in-group preferences. We saw that also in the United States. People voting were not necessarily voting as kind of these traditional voting blocks that are a monolith, right? It can transcend some of these barriers. And another thing we know is that information should be disseminated from a credible source so that you can people are more likely to register that information. Then something on voter coordination kind of speaks to the social aspect. So in the Sierra Leone study that I mentioned at the beginning, when people just listen to the debates on the radio, kind of on their own, that was less effective than when they were watching the screenings together with a group of people. And so there's this social component to knowing kind of what the rest of your community is engaging with. And then obviously, if you know that somebody else watched the debate screening, you can talk to them about it. And there's kind of, it just motivates people to behave in different ways. And then referencing these Mexico studies, the beliefs people have matter, and the way the information is delivered can be really important. Misinformation, like I said, really throws a wrench into all of this. Of course, social media and just access to the internet is really amazing in helping people access information. But of course, misinformation can really lead to polarization, it can lead to violence, it can lead to people kind of voting against what you would think their best interests are. And so there are interventions that we've studied that include, fact checking, media literacy, diversifying people's media diets that can shown to be effective, and they can increase people's ability to recognize false information. But a lot of this happens in US and high-income contexts, and there's a lot of unknowns about how misinformation works in other contexts. We are funding more research on this in Turkey, but it's really difficult to kind of get conclusive answers. So another challenge to election quality, this has to do with overall just fraud, vote buying, corruption. So there are a handful of commonly evaluated programs that do strengthen election integrity. They have to do with, say, new monitoring technologies, just using, say, cell phones or other systems to improve the monitoring of elections, election observers, which is kind of a more traditional way to improve election integrity, and then implementing anti-vote buying campaigns. So I'll walk through some examples that explain these a little bit more and show if they're effective or not. So on the new technology front, new technologies can reduce fraud, and what's great about them is that they're also relatively low cost. So if they're implemented well, that means that they can be pretty effective at improving kind of the integrity of elections and making sure people's votes are actually counted properly. This was a randomized evaluation in Uganda that informed poll workers by letter beforehand, randomly, right? Some poll workers received this letter, some poll workers did not, and they were informed that their tallies would be photographed by smartphone and then compared to official results. And so the poll officers that received this warning letter were more likely to report accurate results. And so this ultimately decreased fraud and then the vote share for the incumbent president, who was kind of more engaged in these fraudulent activities. Then another one was, this has less to do with technology, but it's more about kind of poll observers, but citizen monitoring. So this took place in Colombia, and it was a campaign that encouraged citizens to, that they could report fraud if they saw it through this NGO reporting form. You can see those were kind of the ads that they saw on social media, encouraging people to report people, and that you have the right to do this, and reminding people to vote. And so the citizens who received this targeted ad campaign were more likely to report the election fraud and show proof of the election fraud through photos. And there was therefore a significant reduction in irregularities, and also kind of disincentivized vote buying, because people also who would engage in vote buying saw this campaign and then were also less likely to use that as a strategy. And then this, in the results, led to a decreased share in the votes for candidates who were using these kind of fraudulent tactics. So this kind of crowdsourcing approach, again, also another really low-cost intervention that was able to reduce election fraud. And also kind of, I think, also in a wonderful way made citizens feel accountable for the results of their own election. The tricky thing is, as with all kinds of new technologies, is that they might not always work, or people might not always trust them. So in Kenya, there's this study that wanted to see if a text campaign was an effective way to get people to come vote. And at the same time, in Kenya, they were employing a new biometric ID system to release results in real time. But on the day of the election, both of these technologies malfunctioned. And so I guess you did get to see kind of what happens when things go wrong. And so there's still an increase in voter turnout, but the consequence is that people ended up not trusting the Electoral Commission, which is an understandable outcome. And people then also were less likely to trust the Election Commission if they were experiencing election-related violence, and also people who were whose party lost. So if you think your party lost and you also saw this, the screen wasn't working when you voted, you're more likely to lose trust in this institution. So if you raise people's expectations that, this is going to be a really strong election and we're using this new technology, you have to actually deliver on that promise. Otherwise, you're going to kind of break down trust. Election observation programs are something that we spend lots of money on, I think, as an international community. And they have been shown to reduce fraud, but it really matters the way you do it. So in Mozambique, when domestic observers were placed at fixed locations, so they were assigned to just go to one polling location, there was a decrease in fraud. So there was less ballot stuffing or kind of tallying blank votes. But when, in the same context, international observers were made to rotate around different locations, that didn't impact fraud because politicians then were able to kind of anticipate where these observers might be and then do all the vote stuffing or the ballot stuffing at another location. So having the fixed observers was more effective than having people kind of float. And then a study in Russia found that when domestic observers were assigned to locations right at the last second, there was this really sudden decrease in fraud. And also that message spilled over into other locations. So that meant that politicians and these poll workers that they might have got off likely didn't have time to react and were also kind of apprehensive that other polling locations might be observed. So if, say, you're a policymaker and you're trying to improve the quality of elections, what would you consider? Well, we want to make sure that we understood how corrupt actors would shift their fraudulent activities. So, like I just mentioned, people might decide to, people will still be corrupt even if they know that they're being observed. They'll just try to find a workaround. And then also on the citizen side, these interventions do still affect the way people engage with the political system. So there we have a few studies of how different kinds of observers boost the performance of incumbents, or the campaign that we saw in Colombia and a similar one in Georgia. They can have really differing outcomes. Vote buying. So I guess as a little bit of context, vote buying is when politicians try to get people to vote for their candidate just by simply bribing them. So in Uganda, there was an evaluation that tried to kind of create more of a social movement against vote buying through a lot of different strategies, through community meetings, posters. There were kind of these collective declarations that the villages made to refuse vote buying and really just encourage people to not participate in this. And this resulted in voters casting votes independently of gifts. If they received them, they still might not have followed through with that bribe or with what they were supposed to vote for. There was greater turnout because I think this was just overall a civic education campaign, but parties still engaged in vote buying. So that just meant that once the incumbents were already engaged in vote buying, then challengers viewed that as a campaign strategy, and so then they also increased their vote buying. But still, because people were influenced by this campaign, the vote share of incumbents ultimately decreased. Okay, on to this third one, and I know I'm going through tons of information, so I will answer your questions at the very end, and let me know if I'm okay on time. But this piece of this challenge has a little bit less evidence kind of in this RCT sense of how you can encourage greater participation, but we do have a lot of evidence on civic participation of women, especially in India. There's been lots of efforts there to increase the participation of women. So for example, some countries, including in India, have quotas for women on local government bodies. And this study found that when you have these quotas and they're filled by women, there's an increased provision of public services. So it's just, somehow having this distribution that's more equally split between men and women results in more public services reaching people. And then it also has this kind of gender norms effect that it improves the perception of women as leaders. Another approach is kind of a more community-based approach. So even if you don't have quotas for political participation, through kind of self-help groups, the strengthening of women's networks overall, not just for engagement in politics, but for, like helping each other with businesses or with childcare or what have you, that increases civic participation. So just by having kind of this reinforced community, people are more likely to take part in politics. And then an interesting study out of Pakistan was done on trying to encourage women to vote more. So in Pakistan, it's a rather patriarchal society, and so there's really low turnout for women. And so a campaign that was targeted at women to encourage them to vote basically had null results. It was just not that effective. However, when that same campaign was targeted towards men to encourage just talking about allowing, and encouraging women to vote, then there was an increase in turnout for women. So it kind of reinforces the fact that, that the patriarchal system does influence the participation of women, but when you kind of try to address the gender norms for men, it was able to actually improve outcomes there for women. And I want to say also that there's lots more research that can be done on how to encourage marginalized groups to participate. I just funded a study in Ghana that looks at the different linguistic minorities that exist and the ways that they're able to participate in elections in Ghana. So there will be results soon. Probably next year, the slide will look a little different, hopefully. Okay, lastly, and the most consequential challenge to election quality is election violence. So there have been various campaigns to reduce election violence, and this is something that really, is deadly. So I think in this election in Nigeria, there were, I think, like over 400 people were killed in a kind of through this spate of election violence. And so this intervention was trying to inform people and kind of create this, just to encourage people to not engage in election violence. And the information campaign took place 2 months before the election. So this is another case where timing was kind of theorized to make a difference because election violence can build not just on the day of the election, but preceding the election. And the results of this led to, there was a decreased perception of violence. The likelihood of physical violence declined by 47 percentage points as measured by journalist mentions in the media of physical election violence. There was a greater turnout for voters, so people maybe felt more confidence in the safety of participating in the election. And then there was also a decrease in the vote share for the opposition candidate who tended to be more associated with violence. Back to election observation, this is another strategy that can reduce voter intimidation because I think you could also consider voter intimidation as another form of fraud, and as a way to coerce people into voting a certain way. So this happened in Ghana, where researchers partnered with a local kind of civic organization to evaluate the effect of having observers at polling stations. And so just having observers at these polling stations reduced the probability of intimidation, reduced fraud. So it kind of had this dual effect. It wasn't just reducing violence and coercion, but it also decreased kind of the overall fraud that we talked about before. But the party structure really makes a difference. So depending on if it was a single party constituency election or a multi-party constituency election, like if it was kind of competitive or non-competitive, it changed the way the party approached fraud or violence. So if it was a single party constituency, then they shifted to a more kind of fraudulent strategy. And then conversely, when it was a competitive constituency, it shifted to the more violent strategy. So that doesn't, just because these interventions happened doesn't mean that fraud or violence didn't occur, but it did change the ultimate outcome. So the takeaways here on election violence is that there can be effective ways, right, through information campaigns and observation to mitigate violence. But if you're implementing these policies, you have to understand the incentives of your parties, the ways they're going to behave. And that can kind of inform the approach. There's also kind of a broader set of evidence that that suggests how civic education also just increases participation and might reduce the violence that takes place, but it's still unknown. So there's lots of other open questions. The list goes on, clearly. But we don't know a lot about what motivates politicians to engage in violence, right? We don't know what can shift politicians in incentives to choose violence as a strategy. It's also hard to know how violence impacts voting behavior. Maybe people are scared to vote and so they don't vote, or maybe they're scared and they vote for a candidate that they think will make them safe. So there's lots of these open questions that we hope to fund more research on. So those were all of the different ways and different approaches to improve the quality of elections. I think some key takeaways that I'd love for you all to leave the room with are that information really makes a difference. So it matters for that information to be high quality, but informing voters about candidates and about issues can change the way that people vote. And it has to be, like I said, widely disseminated from a credible source. The tricky part is misinformation. So I think there needs to be more experimentation or research done on different approaches to tackle misinformation and the ways, the kind of different manifestations and sources of misinformation. But overall, informing voters does lead to people participating in democracy more actively. New technologies are just a really cost-effective way to improve election monitoring, reduce fraud, but they also have to be reliable and trusted, and to also lead to the ultimate effect of just greater trust in institutions. Political inclusion can be improved through, like I mentioned, those studies in India about just encouraging the social networks and building the civic skills and education of women. But there still needs to be more research done on other marginalized groups. And then investing in more research on election violence. Those two studies I said are just kind of small examples, but clearly there's an increase in election violence happening worldwide. And I think more causal evidence would be really informative. And lastly, kind of this broader takeaway is that policymakers ought to use these findings to inform the election processes, because lots of the processes that are set up are kind of set up based on politicians' intuitions or historical processes, or maybe international institutions come in and say, this is how you should run your election. But every context is going to be slightly different, and the research that we have can kind of inform the decisions that you make and how elections are structured, not just on the day of the election, but in the whole run-up to an election, so that people can participate in democracy in a more kind of fair and just way. So those are my takeaways, and I'd love to answer any questions.
I'd love to hear a little bit about how kind of some of the findings of these studies and the recommendations change as the size of an election increases in terms of who's voting in it, I guess. Because you mentioned some of the candidates were more involved with their constituents in certain situations when more information was available and the turnout increased. And obviously that would change if we're looking at the federal level in the United States or sort of a national government level or other communities. So I'm just curious if there's been any different findings for different sizes of elections.
Yeah, definitely. So some of these studies were focusing on parliamentary elections, some on local mayoral elections. And I think it depends. I think the difference would be, say, on a local election level, yes, candidates would campaign more directly, they'd have town halls, they'd do that sort of thing. If you go to a more kind of federal level, and I think candidates would just campaign more on policy, rather than relying on those other strategies. But I think it, say in the United States, the Democrats campaigned more on policy, Republicans campaigned more on rhetoric. But I think I think that's kind of a different case study, and it's hard to know, tease out the impact, say, of misinformation and regular trustworthy information on people's decisions. So I think, more research will be my final answer on how to tease that out.
And more of a Western worldview, kind of going back to what Izzy was talking about with the US election, how would you, and you said they wanted to do more research, but how do you incentivize the combating of misinformation, particularly when targeting media companies? I think that's the biggest consideration about the US.
So encouraging media to not
Yes.
engage in this.
Yes.
I think that's a really difficult question. I think the incentives that private companies have are very different from the incentives that government has. So I think, media companies want to have more engagement, they want to, sell more ads. And so I think an intervention that addresses those incentives, if we were to take this RCT approach and apply it there, that would kind of be a way to address it. But I also think that it's kind of an impossible thing to address with an RCT. You can't apply this system to everything, and I think, there's already been kind of the capture of different journalistic, like the Washington Post or the LA Times, that clearly there's the owners of those newspapers kind of have influence on what gets published. And so you can't do an RCT on how to encourage Jeff Bezos to, let his op-ed writers take a stance on the election, right? But I wish we could. I would love to know how we can encourage them to do it. But,
On kind of a similar note, I just want to ask a question about specifically what kind of defines a credible source. And the reason I ask that is because I know that you just said information can be controlled. The kinds of information, who's presenting the information, affects bias and credibility. Is there any patterns you recognize in these kinds of what people perceive as credible and unbiased, even when it may or may not be?
Yeah, that's a great question. And who gets to define the terms of information is really important. I think, say, if we're trying to inform people on how corrupt politicians are, using the actual facts, say, on the misuse of funds is a really clear way to show people that, this isn't just someone's opinion that so-and-so is a corrupt mayor just because I'm saying so, but that we have, say, we looked at the records of their use of federal funds and tax dollars and saw, okay, well, they siphoned off this much for personal expenses, and they said they were going to spend this much on improving roads, but actually only this much was spent. There was a study in Mexico that used a Facebook information campaign to tell people what percentage of funds were misused, and using kind of these federal audits of local governments to say that 97% of funds ended up being used properly, or 86% of funds ended up being used properly, like where they said they were supposed to go. So I think relying on those kinds of discrete facts is a way to get people to say they could do the research themselves if they wanted to, but we have, say, like a nonprofit telling you this is the difference. I think there's probably other contexts where it's harder to inform people, but I think when you're talking about, say, if you're going to re-elect an incumbent, having ways to show that their performance was poor, then that's maybe a way to convince people. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about this kind of a shift towards like shorter sound bites and content, and how that affects the access to information in the election?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely kind of chaos agent. And I don't think, I was reflecting earlier during both of your presentations on how kind of the standard, classical standard of democracy that we have is really at odds with a modern media environment, because could you even, if people are voting based on misinformation, yes, they are making their choices, but is that kind of is that still a pure democracy when you don't know what is influencing their decisions? That's a more philosophical question, but I think that the impact of sound bites also is, encourages and the shortening of everyone's attention spans makes it such that really kind of fast emotional responses are more easily evoked. So I would say that, it's much harder to have a really quick soundbite on Biden's or, Kamala Harris's proposal for, whatever economic policy she wants to enact or whatever energy policy she believes in. That's a lot harder to put into 30 seconds than it is to, kind of fearmonger about immigrants or whoever, whatever population. So, and I think then people are, pushed to have an emotional response and react to that. So that's, I guess, just like a piece of analysis. I think it would be great to have a study that focuses on having kind of short form videos on as a way to distribute more information to people, but as of yet, I'm not aware of any.
I have one other question. Is there any controversy regarding these types of studies?
Yes.
Because I'm hearing it sound like someone could definitely make an argument, especially if it's not going their way, that it's some form of election interference or like trying to sway an election in some way or another, right?
Yeah, definitely. So this kind of research definitely has in the past, come, it's very easy if you just like look at it on a surface level to say, oh, we're experimenting on people, right? And these Western researchers are coming in and testing whether a health policy is effective or not. I think the response to that is that usually, governments try different policies all the time. They spend lots of money on policies. And if you take a step back and before you implement a policy to every constituency and you evaluate that policy, you will know if you should proceed with that policy, right? So even in this election context, many countries or many international observers that governments allow into countries to help monitor their elections, they want to have, say, election observers. They want to reduce election violence, right? That's not kind of a desirable outcome. And so I think by allowing for this kind of research to happen, you're able to know for future elections what's most effective, right? Like we saw that kind of different approach in the first election in Mexico that they evaluated, and then in the next one kind of get this other learning. But yeah, I think it's definitely kind of an ethical question. I will say that when we fund research like this, we do take a very kind of strong ethical stance on the components of an election or of an intervention, and making sure that there's local actors involved. So oftentimes these interventions happen with, and basically all the time actually, with local NGOs or local civil society organizations or local governments that want to see if their approaches are working. So it's not that foreign researchers are coming in and kind of just testing on research subjects. They're just making sure that existing organizations are able to make better decisions in the future.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to all three of our speakers. Now we're going to give you guys a quick little intermission before our panel discussion, which will happen up front here. So let's take about 10 minutes and let everybody stretch their legs, go to the bathroom, do all that fun stuff. And we'll reconvene in about 10. So loud. No.
I don't think I want to know. I don't want to know.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Of course, yeah.
No.